In the room, where the only sound was the steady ticking of the old clock hanging on the wall, an unsettling silence reigned. The walls appeared darkened by time, and I could feel every silent breath of this old house. My eyes lifelessly drifted across the grim wooden panels, while a weight grew in my chest, not from physical exhaustion, but from something deeper, something beyond description. I couldn't help but notice how the ticking of the clock grew louder, almost as if it wasn't just a sound, but some incomprehensible echo of what was happening inside me. Opposite me sat John, my husband, with whom I had lived for nearly 3 decades. From the day we met, there had always been something mysterious, elusive, in his eyes. But now, there was not even a trace of the fire that had once made me forget everything else. He didn't look at me as usual, didn't acknowledge my presence. His gaze held neither love nor irritation, only emptiness. His attention was fixed on the television, and his hands numbly gripped the remote, as if trying to hold on to something that could distract him from everything around him. I sat across from him, watching as he seemed to dissolve into those fleeting images, into a reality that seemed more important to him than I was. How many years had I lacked the strength to break free from this vicious cycle? How many times had I tried to convince myself that this was how it was meant to be? We had spent 3 decades together, but what did that mean? Life had passed in routine conversations, in daily trivialities, in things that once seemed important but had now become mere obligations. I could hardly feel him beside me anymore. He was a stranger I shared this house with, these days, but not my soul. My gaze slid across his face, searching for even a hint of the warmth that once enveloped me. But instead, I only felt the cold. My own thoughts, like fog, thickened in my mind, and I felt the weight of countless resentments and suppressed disappointments that had built up over the years. I had never allowed myself to tell him the truth, never allowed myself to pour out all that poison. But now, when I could hardly breathe from the pressure, I felt it reaching its boiling point. I could no longer remain silent. "Are you done moving on?" His voice, low and irritated, sliced through the silence like a cold knife, cutting off my thoughts. He didn't look at me, didn't meet my gaze. Even in this moment, when I was ready to tear this web of silence apart, he didn't deign to give me a single look. I studied his features, trying to find something that could bring me back to this life, but instead, I felt his mocking grin slide off his lips ominously. "Are you serious?" he said, not surprised, but with the kind of expression one would wear after hearing something utterly insignificant. "And where are you going to go, Stella? You won't manage on your own without me." His words were as predictable as ever, but they still struck me. I could feel everything burning inside me with rage, with pain, at the fact that he was once again deciding that I couldn't live without him. He had always been so sure of his power over me, of his righteousness, of his belief that he was the center of my universe. But I no longer believed that. I had long since stopped believing in these absurd claims, which were nothing more than a pathetic manifestation of fear. I forced myself to sit up straight, as if the universe had suddenly contracted to this moment, and everything around me ceased to exist. How many times had I heard such words? How many times had he repeated these phrases, thinking that in doing so, he was keeping me by his side? But now I knew, I was no longer afraid. His mockery was predictable, and instead of breaking me, it only awakened in me the resolve that had long been brewing in the shadows. "I'm leaving, John," I said, and my voice sounded so confident that he fell silent. This was the moment when I finally took a step. I realized that all this time, I hadn't been living, I had been existing. Living for him, for his expectations, for his restrained feelings. But what had I gotten in return? He was no longer the person I wanted to spend my life with. It was just a habit that had kept me here. John looked at me, but there was no surprise, no reaction in his eyes. Only fatigue and habit. He didn't even try to stop me. His mocking smile, like his words, was empty. I might have expected him to say something else that would pull me back into this cruel cycle, but he said nothing. His silence was the heaviest sentence of all. He had always thought I couldn't manage without him. But that was his mistake. I had put up with it for too long. John's mother's constant criticism and manipulation only worsened the toxic atmosphere in our home. She somehow managed to be everywhere at once, always aware of every step I took, every word I spoke. All her attempts to intervene in our relationship, in every aspect of my life, cornered me, and John, usually, didn't dare intervene. He didn't see the problem. He didn't want to see it. He simply turned his head the other way, preferring not to notice. Over time, I realized that her presence was like a constant storm, one that approached and tore something apart, burning me from the inside. I couldn't take it anymore. More and more often, I locked myself in my office, hoping for a moment of silence, but it never lasted long. John would come home with her calls on his phone, with her voice in the hallway, with his whispers about how I should be grateful for everything she had done for us. This was her way, making me feel indebted to her, not only for my place in the house, but for my life itself. And I could no longer stand it. I found solace in a modest, yet peaceful apartment that became my refuge. It was a place where I could finally breathe freely and reflect, without being subjected to judgment. Spacious, though not as luxurious as our house, it was mine. My property. My corner, where no one dared to intrude except for myself. I needed solitude to restore my soul, my sense of self. Here, I could be myself, without fear, without constant pressure. I no longer needed John's words or his mother's condemning looks, their demanding and tormenting expectations. I could simply exist. In the following days, I made my decision. I ignored the barrage of calls and messages from John, from his mother, who tried to disrupt my peace. John, not receiving any response or signs of sympathy from me, became threatening, shouting, but I didn't react. He called me again and again, left voicemail messages full of threats and tears, but I blocked my ears and didn't listen. His mother, wavering between internal agreements and threats, also couldn't break me. She tried to find a weakness, whatever it might be, but I remained unshaken. My determination was ironclad. I was no longer the woman who endured humiliation day after day, who accepted being ignored, unappreciated, unheard. I was no longer the one who feared saying no. And now, sitting in my cozy yet modest apartment, I felt my inner self beginning to recover. During this time, I continued working at the library, where I had been for many years. My colleagues noticed how my spirit had gradually faded as I tried to keep everything together, hiding the pain. But now, they were witnessing my rebirth. In the quiet and support of the library, among books and understanding friends, I rediscovered myself. Every morning, when I came to work, I felt a small but firm hope growing in my chest. Hope for the future. I could dream again, plan again, believe that everything wasn't over. I could take responsibility for my own life. My colleagues, those who had been with me for many years, gradually noticed how I was changing. At first, it was small details, a slight smile, an occasional cheerful laugh that had once been rare. And then I began to tell them more about myself, about what I had gone through, and they supported me, sharing their experiences. It seemed strange to me that such small things, like conversation, like attention, could heal so profoundly. In their eyes, I saw respect and understanding, things I had lacked in John's house. They saw me as a woman, not just someone's wife or someone's subordinate. Over time, I began to adapt to my new identity. I increasingly felt like an independent, strong woman who was no longer afraid to walk her own path. I realized that my life wasn't just about home, about my relationship with John, about the long years spent in failed attempts to keep peace in the family. My life was mine, and only I could decide how to live it. I began to rediscover the world beyond the walls of our house, beyond his mother and her endless comments. Every day, coming home to my apartment, I felt my confidence grow. The walls that once seemed cold and lifeless now became my allies. I felt strength filling me, the remnants of fear, doubt, and regret disappearing. Everything I had gone through had become part of me, but it no longer dictated how I should live. I began to nurture a new hope for the future, and although I still had a long way to go, I knew I was ready now. This new chapter in my life was dedicated to liberation from years of control and to a new discovery of the path I was just beginning to walk. I felt that with each day, I was shedding my old skin, as if everything that had happened before was turning into a vague, insignificant past. I was learning to live for myself, not for those who imposed their presence, their roles, their expectations on me. It was difficult to break free from familiar ways, difficult to find myself among so much that had been instilled in me, and perhaps even hammered into me. But I could no longer be a slave in my own home. I could no longer allow their presence to continue destroying my soul. It was too much. I began to find my voice, even if it sounded too quiet to be heard. Ariana's criticism often reached my ears. It was like a constantly buzzing insect that wouldn't give me peace. Every word of hers, filled with arrogant judgment, every look, saturated with her endless sense of self-importance, repeatedly pierced me like needles. But that wasn't what eventually led me to my decision. I had learned to ignore her criticism, her advice that made no sense and brought me nothing but pain. It was just background noise in my life, noise I had pushed to the background. But what truly shattered my resolve was the revelation of John's deceit. It was like lightning splitting the sky on a dark night. One day, by accident, I came across the bank statements and noticed something odd. Amounts I couldn't understand. Large sums withdrawn from our joint account, sums that made no sense. When I carefully checked all the statements, I realized this money had been squandered. It hadn't been spent on family needs, on everyday expenses, but on useless pleasures. Ariana's gambling addiction and John's secret whims, of which I had known nothing. He had always been good at hiding his weaknesses, masking them as something innocent. But now I saw the truth. I saw what was hidden behind his smooth phrases and calm demeanor. He had always been a master at saying what I wanted to hear. But now, this false world was crumbling to pieces. Any attempt to address these issues led to tense arguments with John. He became like a stone wall, stubbornly defending his mother, her strange whims, her dependence on me and our home. He always said the same thing: "She's my mother, Stella, she needs this." His voice carried a dull certainty, and he dismissed my concerns as if they didn't matter. With each passing time, his words became colder and more contemptuous. I could feel the love that had once been in his eyes disappearing. The love that was no longer there. But the real turning point came when I accidentally overheard a conversation that shattered my world once and for all. I walked into the room and caught them halfway through. John and Ariana were sitting at the table. He was holding some kind of document, and her voice sounded restrained, yet confident. I didn't want to eavesdrop, but what I heard made me freeze in place. They were plotting to take full control over our finances. And, what was even worse, they planned to reduce me to a mere observer in my own home. I heard John say, "She won't be able to do anything. We'll support her, but she needs to understand that she has no place in decision-making." His words were cold, and there was nothing in them that resembled the person I once built my life with. I stood there, and in my mind, a full picture instantly came together. This wasn't just betrayal. This was the final act of something I could no longer ignore. I couldn't live in this house anymore, in this game, in these fake lives. I had no choice. My resolve grew stronger with each passing moment. I couldn't allow my years, my efforts, my life to become part of this distorted theater. That was when I realized I could no longer tolerate life under their control. My gaze at John was as sharp as a knife. I could no longer turn a blind eye to everything that was happening. It was too much. I started to act, and now there was no turning back. "How could you expose me like that?" His voice was full of disbelief, as though he couldn't believe I dared to take a step that violated all our conventions. "You expose yourself, Stella," he replied. I stood before him, feeling a strange calm rise in my chest. Yes, I had exposed him. But not only him. I had exposed this entire life we had been leading, day after day, year after year, as if it were some kind of game in which the rules had long been forgotten. This wasn't just an exposure, it was a liberation, a long-awaited freedom from the lies, manipulations, and pretense hidden behind the walls of our home. I responded to him with a measured tone, trying not to let the internal turmoil, which was soon to become my new breath of life, show. "I'm simply bringing the truth to light." In his eyes, I saw something akin to anger, to hurt, but he quickly suppressed it, trying to find a justification. But I could no longer go back. I could no longer fall under his control again. He wasn't just my husband. He was part of a system that mocked my dignity and my right to be myself. Ariana was also caught in the trap, although she tried to appear as though she were in control of the situation, but her actions were no longer as convincing. She tried to defend herself by accusing me of betrayal, seeing my actions as nothing more than an act of war. But the fear she once instilled in me gradually faded. I was no longer afraid of her. I was no longer afraid of these people, their voices and looks, their slippery manipulations. It no longer had power over me. "No, Ariana," I replied, not allowing my words to settle in my voice as weakness. "This isn't war, it's responsibility." I looked at her with a clarity I had never had before. This wasn't an act of revenge, nor a desire to destroy her world. It was simply responsibility for my life, for the truth I had carried within me for so long but was afraid to speak out loud. I made my decision. I would live by my own rules. I would rebuild my life from scratch, free of all these chains. When I looked at John, his face had drained of color. He stood with his mouth open, unable to say a word. All that was left for him was to watch as his social circles, his old connections, crumbled. This was proof that I was right. I believed in the truth. And the truth could not be hidden forever. His allies began to back off, afraid of his now tainted reputation. They quickly realized that public opinion had shifted. They could no longer stand beside him, hiding their eyes and falling silent when he passed by. Over time, they disappeared. And I no longer tried to understand why they acted this way, because I no longer needed their understanding. They were all part of what I was leaving behind. Ariana's influence also began to weaken. She lost her strong position, her gambling addiction, and manipulative tactics became public knowledge. The world where she had once felt like a queen collapsed. But all of this was just the beginning. My pursuit of justice didn't end with them tarnishing their social reputations. That was only the first step, the one that exposed what they had been hiding from me, from all of us. I realized their financial vulnerability, their Achilles heel, the weakness they had so carefully concealed. I carefully studied their accounts, their behavior, their spending, and soon it became clear to me, John and Ariana had an entire web of manipulations, including financial ones. John had been hiding his debts for years, shifting them onto my shoulders, knowing that I would nervously monitor every penny, while he kept earning without noticing how he was sinking deeper into a financial pit. Ariana, on her part, used everything I had, including money, to feed her addictive behavior, going to casinos, gambling, where her money vanished like sand slipping through her fingers. I understood that this wasn't just manipulation or underestimation of me as a person. It was a whole system, a system built on my fear and misunderstanding. And now that I had figured out their vulnerabilities, I knew they could no longer control me. This was my weapon. Ariana, on the other hand, resorted to a more covert tactic. She didn't shout, she didn't openly fight me like her son did. She was sly, as always. She tried to turn family members against me, positioning herself as the victim. Her efforts were in vain, but still, she didn't give up. She tried to exploit every situation. Every gesture and look of hers was aimed at tarnishing my image, making everyone believe that I was the one destroying their world. "Stella, you're tearing our family apart," she said, accusingly, when we ran into each other by chance at the grocery store, where I had gone to buy a few simple things. I felt her words, as always, trying to strike at me from within. But now, in that moment, I no longer felt the familiar pain. I simply looked at her, feeling a slight sense of relief, as if her accusations had become something distant, insignificant. "This family was broken long before I left," I replied, not hiding my calm. With every word, I felt her power diminishing, her manipulations no longer achieving their goal. She tried again to influence me, repeating the same phrases that once made me tremble, but I was no longer the person who had once sat in their house, gripped by fear and helplessness. I was free. I had embraced my newfound independence, and nothing could bring me back to that old, withered world. My refusal was precise and undeniable. I didn't let her see how I was suffering, no matter how much she wanted that. Now, I enjoyed my freedom, the freedom to dictate my own life, the freedom to finally be myself. Soon, I made a decision that, although it seemed drastic, actually became an act of complete liberation for me. I severed their direct access to me, changing my phone number and cutting off all remaining connections. I didn't need their calls, their messages, or the faces that had once been my loved ones but were now nothing more than shadows. I didn't want their poison to seep back into my life. I was ready to move forward. And I finally found peace. I dedicated my time to the local shelter, helping those who had faced similar hardships, those who, like I once did, were seeking a light at the end of the tunnel. People who needed simple words of encouragement, those who needed hands ready to help, not hands that would drown them. There, among these people, I felt for the first time that I could be of use, that my struggles hadn't been in vain, that I could give a piece of myself to those who truly deserved it. But despite all this, my quest for justice was far from over. Everything I had endured couldn't simply be forgotten. It couldn't be left without consequence. I learned of Ariana's intention to challenge the court's verdict, clinging to a futile hope of reclaiming the funds that had been so recklessly squandered by her and John. She still believed she could get back what was lost, regain control. But I knew she was wrong. She no longer had the strength to stand back up. She couldn't manipulate people the way she once did. And despite her stubbornness, I understood that her time had passed. With every attempt to reclaim what she had lost, her reputation was crumbling further. I was ready for the next step, for the next round of this battle. I couldn't let her or John continue their games, hiding behind lies and manipulations. They thought they could live in their safe worlds, knowing they could always tear my life apart, but they didn't understand that everything had already changed. I was ready to fight not just for justice but for my new life, my new identity. The struggle was just beginning. Several months had passed since the court's decision in my favor, but the consequences of those events continued to echo. Time couldn't erase all that had been destroyed. It couldn't return what had been irretrievably lost. John and Ariana, now cut off from their former social circles, were merely shadows of who they had once been. Their world had collapsed, and despite their attempts to rise again, their strength had been broken. Ariana could no longer manipulate people the way she used to, and John seemed doomed to a long fall. Their well-being turned to dust, and the shadows of their former grandeur now slid across the ruined spaces where our home once stood. I, in the meantime, was starting to get used to my new life, to the new circumstances I had built for myself. I had become a woman again, no longer a shadow of someone else, no longer part of someone else's game. The time I spent alone allowed me to see things in a new light. I didn't live in the past, nor did I allow myself to regret what had happened. But I didn't forget. I couldn't. One day, during an unexpected visit, my son Elias brought troubling news. His behavior was weighed down with worry, and his eyes spoke more than words when he opened his mouth to speak. When he appeared at my door, he seemed older than I remembered, even though only a short time had passed. There was something muffled, heavy in his voice, and I felt the anxiety slip into my heart. "Mom," his words were cautious, as if he didn't know the best way to say it. "Dad's been fired from his job. His drinking got worse. And Grandma lost everything. She sold the house to pay off the debts. Everything, it's all falling apart." He spoke of it like some distant tragedy, not expecting that I would be able to change anything. He passed the weight of those words to me, and they hung in the air like an unbearable burden. My heart tightened in pain, even though I had long stopped feeling guilty for their mistakes. We had gone down different paths, and I knew their downfall was a result of their own actions. But despite that, I was there for Elias. He was still a part of me, and that rift, that fracture in the family, was something far more than just the consequences of the court's decision. He stood in front of me, anxious, not knowing what to do with the weight that seemed to have consumed him. In his gaze, there was something broken, as if he was searching for strength in himself that he didn't have. I, for my part, was trying to find the same resilience that had allowed me to be strong not only for myself but also for him. "Mom," he said quietly, looking at me, "are we pushing them too hard? I don't know what to do. Maybe we could help somehow, even just a little." I felt his words reach the very depths of my emotions. But I couldn't lie to myself and say we were at fault. That we could have changed something. We were standing on opposite sides of the river, and despite all the love I still felt for him, we couldn't get back what had been lost. They had chosen their path. "No, Elias," I took his hand, trying to stay firm, when not pushing. "We stand for justice. They chose their path. You can't save them, because they don't want to be saved." His eyes clouded over, and for a moment, I saw that struggle reflected on his face, between parental duty, the desire to help, and the reality he had found himself in. I knew it was hard for him to accept this. All he wanted was to bring his family back to what it had been when he was little. He wanted his dad and grandma to be those people again, not shadows living in their broken habits and recent mistakes. But that couldn't be. Their path had been chosen, and nothing could change it. I kept looking at him, and although I was certain of my position, it was hard for me to accept this decision, just as it was for him. There was pain in his gaze, and it seemed to me that this pain grew deeper with each passing day. But what else could I do? I couldn't return to their world. I couldn't save them. They were responsible for their own downfall. The collapse of John and Ariana, their fall from grace, became a kind of catharsis for me, a process that severed me from the life I had once considered my own. It wasn't just their defeat, it was liberation. But it wasn't without pain. The destruction of John and Ariana's world wasn't my final goal, but it became a side effect of my search for dignity and justice. I didn't seek revenge, I didn't want to witness their fall. I was simply looking for the truth, and, paradoxically, the truth about myself. I could no longer live in the shadow of their manipulations, their fears, and disappointments. I was searching for freedom, my own, without relying on their values and expectations. And at some point, I realized that this search had become the most important thing in my life. Even if it meant I had to destroy their worlds. It wasn't my fault. It was my path to self-discovery, and if anyone was to blame for the destruction, it was them. On a bright autumn afternoon, as I sat in the comfort of my sunlit living room, I reflected on the changes in my life. How everything had changed. How my days had become brighter, quieter, and calmer. How I was learning to trust myself again, rediscovering joys and simple pleasures that had once seemed distant, invisible. Life was gradually becoming my own creation. And even though the changes were difficult and painful, they left no emptiness, only space for something new. I felt something important taking root inside me, making me stronger. And it wasn't because I had won, it was because I had been freed. My reflections were interrupted by Elias' call. His voice was vibrant, filled with energy and excitement, as if the very air around him was vibrating with joy. I smiled, even though my thoughts still lingered on the past. "Mom, Layla, and I are getting married, and we want you to help us plan it," he announced with obvious enthusiasm. I felt joy surge within me, as this simple message filled me with meaning. Thoughts about the future, about how life could bring not only pain but also happiness, were embodied in this one phone call. "That's amazing news, Elias," I replied with genuine excitement. "I'll be happy to help. We'll talk about everything and make it happen properly." Our conversation, full of laughter, plans, and cheerful comments, was a bright departure from sadness. It was a moment when life was once again opening its wide horizons before me, and I could move forward without looking back. I felt the light returning to my soul, as if I had been freed not only from the heavy memories but also from all the old fears that had tormented me. There were times when I thought I would never survive this loneliness, this tyranny of silence, but now, finally, I felt alive. A person who believes in the future again. The intense discussions about the past, about John, about Ariana, about all the people who had once been part of my life, now seemed distant, as if I were speaking about someone else's life. I had learned to let go. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. And although their worlds continued to crumble, I knew that my life was no longer part of that destruction. A few days later, during my usual walk, I ran into Ariana. She was standing nearby, by the old cafe, as if trying once again to find something familiar, but her place in this world had already been lost. She seemed diminished, like a shadow of her former self. She was no longer the woman who had once made me feel worthless. We met each other's gaze, and in her eyes, I noticed something strange. Perhaps it was regret. A moment of realization, when she understood that she couldn't get back what she had lost. But instead of the usual malice or aggression, I saw something different in her eyes: uncertainty. And there was something unbearably vulnerable about it. "Stella," she began, her voice trembling. I could feel her trying to find the words, but unable to say them, as if she herself didn't believe what she was about to say. I must admit, I was caught off guard, not expecting to meet her here, on the street, in this misty autumn silence. She fell silent, and in that silence, like in an empty space, we both remained, not knowing how to continue the conversation. I felt her words trying to break through, but I was no longer the person who could respond to her manipulations. I didn't know how to react to this. Regret? Perhaps. But for me, it no longer mattered.